I got a comment on one of my so-called gentrification videos that made me want to kind of clarify my position on this issue of so-called gentrification. Now, the commenter said that it seems like black people didn't like white people moving into their areas. And that's not the case at all. In many cases, these areas that are so-called gentrified weren't black owned in the first place. A lot of these properties were owned by Jews beforehand and many other white people beforehand. And there were very few black owned properties in these areas. Yes, a lot of black people rented there. And the sad part about that inner city areas was that many of these Negroes had the opportunity to go out and build these areas up. And in some cases, they actually did own property in some areas, but they didn't take the opportunity. They didn't pass down the values of wealth building to the next generation. And the next generation focused on things like chasing women and social currency above building wealth. So that part was their fault in not maintaining what was given to them and not trying to protect and preserve their communities. A lot of people let their communities fall into high crime because they were caught up in things like the drug game and other hustles, and they weren't focused again on wealth building. So that part of the responsibility is the Negro's part in it. However, the other part of the issue with gentrification does not have to do with white people at all. A lot of people think that this is about white people, but this is primarily about economics because your so-called gentrification is basically an economic shell game. You have a lot of rich businesses coming into these areas, and what they do is they wind up supplanting through political means, trying to bring in big chain stores like your Starbucks, your Targets, your Walmarts, and they wind up pushing out small businesses. And then a lot of people are thinking that this is going to change the area, but it's not going to change the area overall. What happens is that a lot of these big corporations move into these inner city areas, they push out the small businesses, they get big tax breaks from the government, and then after about 10 or 15 years, these guys pretty much pull up their stakes and move out. And the reason why they pull out is because these businesses do not wind up performing as well in proportion to businesses in other areas. Moreover, what happens is that they wind up losing their tax credits, and that's the other incentive for them to start pulling up stakes and leaving the area. And then what happens is after these areas wind up having these big businesses pull up their stakes is that the area goes right back into the state of decline, actually in a worse state than it was before. And that's how your so-called gentrification winds up doing 10 times as much damage as it would if they just left that inner city area alone. Because after these politicians and these businessmen have made all their money, they pretty much, again, pull up their stakes and then move on. And that does real serious economic damage because it leaves a gigantic hole in the community. Because during the time of this so-called gentrification, what happens is that when these big businesses come in and they come in and these politicians give them tax breaks, they drive up the value of the real estate in the community. And then what happens is that drives up the property tax rate in the community. So that's why these landlords wind up driving up, trying to raise their rents and raise the values of their properties. However, this is only a short-term effect, and a lot of people do not understand the whole concept of gentrification and how it damages communities because this is only short-term. It only happens for maybe a period of maybe at the most 5 years to about 15 years, and then we start seeing the area decline again because what happens is they cannot maintain that property, those high property taxes, and then the high cost of doing business in many of these areas because even with the tax breaks that these companies get, they wind up still losing money on things like shrink and thefts, and then they also have to still pay these high property taxes. Meanwhile, the residents in the area are suffering due to high rents and other areas. So you're artificially inflating the value of the property, and you're artificially inflating the value of the neighborhood by having this business here, and these guys are getting tax breaks off the top. Meanwhile, there's a slow and steady decline, happening in the community because of this artificial inflation. And because of this artificial inflation, due to this so-called gentrification, what happens is that sooner or later, what happens is these companies, when the Congress changes or the legislature changes, and businesses can't get any more tax breaks or any tax credits, what happens is, again, in addition to the underperformance of the retailers that they bring in the area, they start pulling up stakes and then they move on. And then what happens is, in many of these shopping districts where they brought these new gentrified businesses, is that you wind up with a gigantic hole and a big void in the community because there are no businesses, that were part of that shopping district. What happens is, like we have here in Harlem, we had this Chevrolet Saturn of Harlem, and we had a Pathmark of Harlem, and they opened up in the late '90s. Around a couple of years ago, the auto dealership closed, and then later on we had the Pathmark pretty much closed, and now there's a big gaping hole in the community. Whereas they had smaller businesses around those areas, there are no more smaller businesses around those areas. You have a lot of chain stores, but then you don't have many small businesses in those areas, and that leaves a big, gigantic economic hole in the community. Because after these rich guys get their tax breaks, the community pretty much has no businesses in its community, and then you have the landlords who also suffer because once you've gentrified the area and you've driven up the property values, these guys are paying higher property taxes, and then on top of it, the people there are paying higher rents, but the property really isn't worth that much. And then when you have businesses that leave, the area starts to decline. And that's what I'm seeing happening in your Harlem right now. I see this slow, steady decline because, yeah, they closed the Pathmark, and then they're talking about they're opening up a Whole Foods, but these businesses, again, do not last long term. When I look at these gentrified areas, the businesses last anywhere from 5 to maybe 15 years, and then they just collapse, and then the community is left with a giant void. I saw this happen right here in my own Bronx neighborhood when they opened up this mall here on 161st Street. I forget what they call it, but they had a wall bounce, and A&P opened up a store, and they opened it up about 91, 92, and then by about 98, the wall bounce wound up closing, and there was a big giant hole. Yes, they put a food bazaar there, but the quality was not as high as the wall bounce. So, and the jobs weren't the same because what happens is when those businesses come in, again, the jobs are different, and they start out with really great jobs in the beginning, but then those jobs leave, and then what happens is, again, the neighborhood declines because the businesses change and the businesses um, are changing, and they change for the worse because of the big void. Because what happens is, in '98, they were starting to have the same problems with the wall bounds, with thefts, and then other issues, and the store was not performing in proportion to other stores, so they wound up closing that store, and that's a big problem with this so-called gentrification. It creates these big voids in the community when it comes down to retail, and it also creates big voids when it comes to housing. Because again, once you artificially inflate property tax values and property values, people have to wind up still paying those values even when these businesses decline and even when the value of the property starts to decline. And that can create a major economic chasm in a community long term. And a lot of people don't look at this so-called gentrification in long term. They don't see that, there's a lot of artificial inflation going on and that these properties aren't worth as much. So a lot of people look at it from a racial point that white people are moving in, but you have to look at it from an economic perspective in that, what it does is that it artificially inflates those values of property, making it worth more than it actually is. And that artificial inflation again comes from companies, big business getting tax breaks from politicians to build there. And then what happens is they build things there, but the things actually have no value. Yes, they built a Pathmark in Harlem. Yes, they built a wall bounce on 161st Street at the Concourse Plaza. And yes, these stores came there, but they did not build a solid middle class that would enable the neighborhood to improve its quality of life. It made life better for some rich people at the top who got their tax breaks and their tax credits, but it didn't build a middle class. And that's the same thing I see in your so-called gentrification in Harlem and areas in the Bronx here. What happens is, yeah, they open up a big store, and those stores may pay $8, $9 an hour, but that's not how you're going to build a middle class. Because in order to build a strong community and an economic tax base, you have to have middle class jobs that enable people to be a part of a middle class. And these jobs that they create they're minimum wage jobs that maybe pay $8, $9 an hour or $11 an hour tops. Managerial jobs that may pay $30,000, $40,000 a year, one or two of those. But that's not going to build you a middle class that enables the neighborhood to remain strong. Moreover, what happens is when people are a part of a middle class, they don't want to live in those areas. What they do is they pack up and leave. Yes, you have a couple of hipsters that might come here for about 4 or 5 years, but that's not going to enable you to grow an area. So when I look at this gentrification in the big picture, it does more damage than if they were to allow people to just build small businesses in those areas and have an investment in the community. Because big business really does not have that much invested in the community. It only has a partial investment in the community. It invests in as it gets from the federal and state government. If they can get a tax break or a tax credit, they'll be down with building in the community. However, small business has a heavy investment in the community because small businesses, they pretty much make their money in the community, and they need to have a certain quality of life in the community in order to maintain their base and maintain a middle class. And a lot of people think that gentrification, is going to help long term. But again, I see the long term damage that your so called gentrification does. What happens is these big businesses, again, wind up getting these tax credits, getting tax breaks. Everything is them based on them getting some sort of deal from the government. They'll get their tax breaks, they'll get their tax deals, and then what happens is, again, they open up businesses or they'll build some housing, and then at the end of the day, these guys pull up stakes once they've made their money, and they move on, and then the community winds up in a worse state than it was in before because it has no businesses, lower property values after the inflation, because the property values will start to decline. The tax base starts to decline because you have no businesses, no small businesses, or you have businesses that are underperforming because they've already pretty much, there's nothing there, there's a void, and the entire area pretty much falls apart. And a lot of people, they only think of the short term, which is, oh, they're getting tax breaks, they're getting tax credits, the neighborhood is going to look better. But that's a short term picture. That's not a long term business picture that is going to give you a solid economic base that's going to continue paying taxes. It gives you a short term boost, but long term, the community suffers overall when they do these so called gentrification plans, because most of the people there who are part of the gentrification, so called gentrification, they're not going to be there for 15, 20, 25 years. They're not going to build homes there. They're not going to build a community there. They don't have anything really invested in there. What happens is this is a short-term move for them. After maybe 5, maybe 10 years tops, they're on their way home. They're on their way packing up, getting ready to move back to the suburbs and take their money with them, because again, you cannot really build wealth in these areas outside of the big people who make the tax breaks, and maybe some of the landlords who get tax credits. Everybody else pretty much winds up in a worse economic state than they were before. And this is why your so-called gentrification does more damage than anything. Because I look at all these areas where they're building, again, these businesses and then building these $1 million homes, and I say to myself, again, if you have $1 million homes everywhere, then the value of the property is going to start declining, because what happens is, what makes one set of property more valuable than the other? And if you've got a glut of this type of product in the marketplace, sooner or later you're going to have a market decline. And this is something that is just basic economics, and a lot of people aren't looking at this so-called gentrification and looking at it from a business perspective and seeing the long-term economic damage it's going to do, especially when you add in other concepts such as automation, which pretty much take jobs out of that economy, and robots, which take jobs out of the economy. So you cannot really maintain this model for long. Yes, you improve the neighborhood short term, but the damage that is done long term may take even more decades to fix than what these little so-called gentrification projects do in the short term. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.